gone overshooted the time. So I'll just quickly go. Thanks, Latika, for inviting me. Then we move to the next slide. So basically, the question is the science. What is the science behind the use of JAK inhibitors in dermatomyositis? And today morning, you heard Dr. Nagaraju talking about T cells. I'm going to talk of a different molecule, type 1 interferon. So if you look at the various transcriptomic and proteomic analysis in patients of dermatomyositis with muscle biopsies, we can find that there's an overexpression of interferon type 1. Next slide, please. So as you can see that interferon stimulated gene 15 and HECR5 and USP18, which are other conjugation transcripts, are overexpressed in patients of dermatomyositis with perifascicular atrophy as well as juvenile dermatomyositis. And the same is for HECR5 and USP18. And all of them are type 1 interferon signaling expression markers. Next slide, please. And when we look at the immunoblot, again, you can see that in patients of dermatomyositis with perifascicular atrophy, you can find ISG15 and the other conjugation proteins upregulated. Next slide. Even MIXA, which is one of the most important proteins, which is an antiviral protein expressed because of type 1 interferon induction. You can see the MXA transcripts, again, very significantly elevated in dermatomyositis patients with perifascicular atrophy, and the protein also expressed in dermatomyositis patients with perifascicular atrophy. Next slide, please. Not only in the muscles, but also in the skin of these patients, you can see a significant expression of interferons, specifically interferon beta. Next slide. And in juvenile dermatomyositis also, you can see increased interferon signature in the form of OAS1 gene, which is again a gene triggered by interferon type 1. Next slide. Not only that, if you look at the CDASI versus gene signature, you can find that there's a significant correlation between the disease activity and the gene signature, and CXCL10, which is again a chemokine induced by type 1 interferon response, and specifically interferon beta seem to be found at more high numbers. Next. And when you look at the severity of the disease activity actually correlates with the gene signature and interferon beta. Next slide. So basically, one thing is clear that type 1 interferon is being overexpressed in these muscles, but is it a bystander or is it pathogenic? So when we go to the in vitro studies, next slide. So when we look at the myotubes which are there stained with MF20 and incubated with interferon, you can see that interferon causes atrophy of these myotubes and expression of the interferon genes and the atrophic genes SMERF and atrogen. Next slide, please. Next slide. Not only that, but when you look at the endothelial cell cultures, you can see that interferon can inhibit pseudo proliferation of the capillary. So it inhibits angiogenesis and downregulates VEGF and TGF beta. Next slide, please. And immunohistochemical staining also finds that you find that atrophin and as well as your VEGF and your MIXA, they are expressed in the perifascicular areas and the vessels, the microcapillaries. So clearly, they are pathogenic in patients of dermatomyositis. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at type 1 interferon pathway, we know that type 1 interferon, the intracellular signaling mainly happens through JAK1 and TYK2, as well as JAK1 and JAK1. So basically, if we want to inhibit the intracellular process, maybe targeting this would be good. Next slide. So when we look at the in vitro inhibition using ruxolitinib, let's see what happens. Next slide. So they have shown that these myotubes, if pre-incubated with ruxolitinib and then exposed to interferon, do not have atrophy, and the atrophy is significantly prevented, as well as the neoangiogenesis happens and that is not inhibited. Next slide. So clearly this shows that there is an argument for JAK inhibitors in dermatomyositis. These patients have an overexpression of type 1 interferon. This type 1 interferon clearly does cause myotubular atrophy, perifascicular atrophy, and thereby using a JAK inhibitor would be beneficial. Next slide. And that is what has happened in most of these case reports as Dr. Shwetal has presented. Next slide. And this would be the final slide. So the basic pathophysiology suggested is that there is something triggering the peripheral dendritic cells in the skin and the muscles, and this peripheral dendritic cells then trigger on interferon alpha and beta, which through JAK signaling pathways then go and release the inflammatory cytokines which cause the damage. And hence, theoretically, and maybe as we can see in case reports, if you block the JAKs, maybe we would be able to ameliorate this disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rath and Dr. Pandey, for an interesting presentations.